Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. Unfortunately, today's video is going to be around a deeply important yet incredibly difficult topic surrounding the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government. Specifically surrounding a subject that I am deeply passionate about, Star Trek, but using that as a way to talk about a much broader and necessary discussion on how we speak out about that ongoing genocide, as well as how we react to people that we care about or respect, both personally and professionally, when they choose not only to not speak out against the ongoing genocide, but use their platform and name to be able to actually support said actions. In particular, I want to talk about writer and Star Trek Deep Space Nine showrunner Ira Steven Behr recently signing a letter condemning director Jonathan Glazer after his speech for winning the Best International Film Oscar for his movie this year, The Zone of Interest. A speech in which he, a Jewish man, spoke up in support of the Palestinian people and against the use of Jewishness to further said genocide against them. I do wish to just say before we get into all of this, for especially those of you who may not be following me elsewhere, while I have been very outspoken about Israel's actions towards the Palestinian people on various social medias as well as my YouTube community tab on my main channel where I have articulated my views on what's happening right now, I have not made a direct video about this mostly because A, I have a video that I actually filmed way back in October and November of last year that is on a much broader topic that will include a segment on Palestine that'll be coming out probably next week on my main channel as part of a larger discussion, and B, there have been many other videos, many of which I have shared by fantastic creators who have said pretty much exactly what I would say on this topic. And in particular, if you wish to learn more about my specific views overall on this conflict, I would actually direct you to a wonderful video by my fellow YouTuber and friend Olaimi that goes into all of this. Her experience with understanding this topic and how she discusses it in her video that will again be linked below very much mirrors my own thoughts and experience as well. That being said, the reason I am making this video in particular is because I know I am a decently heard voice within my very niche community of the Star Trek world, and I have not heard a lot of people within the Star Trek community talking about this. And while I may not be the biggest voice elsewhere in terms of reaching people when it comes to discussions about Palestine, it behooves me to say something directly about this within my own niche community. And I do hope that if you are part of the Star Trek community and you feel the same as I do, that you would also feel emboldened to please speak out about this. Before we get to Ira Steven Behr, let me give you some context for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to Jonathan Glazer. Last year, Jonathan Glazer released a film that he directed and wrote called The Zone of Interest. It's a very difficult yet important film surrounding the Holocaust, but most specifically around a family of a Nazi officer who lived right next to a concentration camp where many Jewish people were murdered during that genocide. Most of the film does not depict any of the genocide directly, but you hear it going on in the background. And the movie itself is about how people willfully ignore the horrors that they are both complicit in and are directly around them in order to try and live their normal lives. It is a deeply moving and disturbing film, and one that does not just resonate with the Holocaust of the 1940s, but also with today and the ongoing Palestinian genocide. Many people have called what is happening now in Gaza and to other places where Palestinian people are living within Israel the first ever live stream genocide, and in many sad and disturbing ways that feels quite accurate. There are many videos on social media not only of the horrors being enacted by the Israeli government against the Palestinian people, but of IDF soldiers gleefully participating in said acts, as well as civilians both in Israel and elsewhere cheering on Israel's actions. But despite the horrors that many of us can plainly see happening before us, many Western cultures, groups, institutions, and people have continued to help perpetuate Israeli propaganda in order to justify the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. This is something that many Western countries, the United States in particular, have been complicit in for decades now, and in particular President Biden has been also complicit in, not only throughout his entire career.
It's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made.
But in the past few months, in him giving support to the Israeli government. As many people already are aware, there's been a lot of propaganda and narratives pushed in order to help support Israel in its actions. such as false stories of baby beheadings, as well as the continual conflation of all Palestinian people with the group Hamas, in order to justify the horrific violence used against the entirety of the Palestinian people in a collective punishment. And while I have not checked out her other work yet, I would highly recommend this video by Dr. Fatima titled "Astronomy Has a Colonialism Problem," that is overtly focused on the building of a telescope in Hawaii, but features an extended and fantastic section on the history of Zionist propaganda towards the Palestinian people and how it has propagated after the events of October 7th of last year. However, one particular aspect of this Zionism is the conflation of Judaism and Israel itself. A conflation that Israel has intentionally stoked and used for decades in order to push aside any criticism of their actions as anti-Semitic. When, in actuality, the conflation of Israel, the nation, and its actions with not only Judaism, but also the entire people of Israel is itself anti-Semitic, as it causes the conflation of Jewish people and Judaism with the horrific genocidal actions of Israel, and is something often used by many anti-Semitic groups in order to create anti-Semitic narratives against Jewish people, building itself on the back of the absolute horror at Israel's actions against the Palestinian people. I would actually highly recommend watching this fantastic video by Step Back History that goes into how the far right is using pro-Palestinian rhetoric to generate anti-Semitic narratives within left-leaning spaces, and why we need to fight back against that and be vigilant for it. And I wish to say this up front: if anyone is watching this that is conflating Israel with Jewish people to attack Jewish people themselves, you can go straight up yourself. I want to be very clear about that in case anyone decides to take a different message from this video. Jewish people and Israel's actions are not the same. I stand in solidarity with Jewish people in the face of the anti-Semitism that they are not only facing today, but have faced for decades and centuries. But this particular version of Zionism is perhaps why director Jonathan Glazer decided to use his platform when he won the Oscar to speak out against this usage of Judaism. A speech that I'm going to play a snippet of for you right now.
All our choices were made to reflect and confront us in the present, not to say, look what they did then, rather look what we do now. Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel, or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all are victims of this dehumanization. How do we resist? Alexandra Bistron Kaladziejczak, the girl who glows in the film as she did in life, chose to. I dedicate this to her memory and her resistance. Thank you.
Listening to that speech, it is quite clear what Jonathan Glazer is trying to say. That he, as a Jewish man, refutes the use of Judaism to justify the genocide of the Palestinian people. However, many Zionists have tried to take Jonathan Glazer's words directly out of context to make it seem as if he was refuting his Jewishness, in order to again propagate this narrative of it being anti-Semitic in order to support the Palestinian people against Israel's actions, which brings me in particular to the thing that spurred me to make this video. Very soon after Jonathan Glazer's speech, a letter was written and put out that was signed by several prominent Jewish artists within the Hollywood community condemning Jonathan Glazer's speech. Again, directly misinterpreting his words and intentions with that speech in order to show support for Israel's actions. And again, want to be very clear here, I am saying several prominent Jewish creators, not all Jewish creators, and in fact many other Jewish creators such as Hari Neff, Joel Cohen, Todd Haynes, and Joaquin Phoenix signed a letter in support of Jonathan Glazer, just to be very clear that I am not conflating all Jewish people with those who signed this letter condemning Jonathan Glazer. But in particular, the one that I wish to talk about today is Ira Steven Behr, who again, as I mentioned before, was a writer on Star Trek The Next Generation and was the showrunner for Star Trek Deep Space Nine. The reason that I want to call out Ira Steven Behr in particular is, number one, again, I am a prominent voice within the Star Trek community, and I think it needs to be made known that Ira Steven Behr is supporting Israel's actions through his condemning of Jonathan Glazer's speech, but also for two other reasons that we'll get into a broader discussion. The first and least important is that it was honestly rather shocking to me to see Ira Steven Behr's name on that list, particularly because he was the writer of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, a show that featured the character of Colonel Kira, one of the main characters of the show who was a former terrorist who fought back against the fascist occupation of her land by the alien Cardassians. A settler colonial government that not only stole resources from her home planet of Bajor, but also genocided her people. Deep Space Nine's creator, Michael Piller himself, directly cited the Palestinian people alongside indigenous folks in America, as well as Jewish people throughout history, as inspiration for the Bajorans, and Kira Nerys in particular.
If you go back to the beginning when we were creating the issue of why the Federation was coming here and the franchise that would create the continuing storylines that Bajorans would provide us, we saw in it certainly parallels to the Palestinians. We saw parallels to the Israeli formation. We saw parallels to the American Indians. We used our feelings, our knowledge of those events and the troubles that seem, many of them are unfortunately lessons we don't ever seem to learn. We keep doing the same thing to people over and over again in different places in different ways. But some of the lessons can be explored. And by giving it a little distance, by calling it Bajor, you have an opportunity to look at it a little more objectively than you would if you were trying to tell somebody about Israel or the Palestinians and the American Indians.
Even the executive producer of the Star Trek franchise, Rick Berman, someone who I don't have a ton of respect for, at least understood this, as he cites in this quote. The Bajorans are not necessarily a one-for-one of Palestinian people, but are more a pastiche of different groups, peoples, and cultures who have faced the threat of settler colonialism and genocide from that. And Deep Space Nine itself, especially under the time that Ira Steven Behr was showrunner of the show, provided a complex portrait of someone like Kira Nerys.
Do you know how many Bajorans died in the labor camps during that time? Died while my mother sat sipping Kanar with Ducat.
If you hate her that much, why did you save her life?
Believe me, there's a part of me that wishes that I hadn't. But the fact is, no matter what she did, she was still my mother.
While I'm not here to provide a deep, in-depth analysis of Deep Space Nine, as that's something I'll do actually elsewhere on my main channel, hopefully within the next year or so, what I will say is that Deep Space Nine featured numerous episodes where it dove into the complex situations that someone like Kira Nerys, who grew up under the horrific conditions of a fascist society attempting to genocide her people, has to make.
Execute him.
No. I was here to find the list. The names of the Bajorans who were selling us out. We'd been informed that Vatrick was our direct link to Ducat. Obviously, I never found the list. But that's what I was looking for in his shop when Vatrick walked in on me. I didn't have a choice.
I misjudged you, Major.
Unlike today, where many people attempt to distract from Israel's horrific actions by asking the question, do you condemn Hamas? Deep Space Nine looked at Kira Nerys, a woman who was a terrorist, who performed many morally questionable and horrific actions during her time fighting against the fascist regime that controlled her homeland, and asked us not necessarily to condemn or praise her actions, but to understand them, and to understand why she did what she did.
Why are you doing this?
For Cardassia. Cardassia will only survive if it stands in front of Bajor and admits the truth. My trial will force Cardassia to acknowledge its guilt. And we're guilty, all of us. But that is necessary.
What you're asking for is another murder. Enough good people have already died.
This is not me approving unnecessarily of all of Kira's actions, nor of Hamas specifically, but to understand the situations that people who are undergoing a genocide endure and the choices that they have to make in order to fight for their own liberation and personhood in the face of abject cruelty and inhumanity. And so to see Ira Steven Behr, the man who ran that show, sign this letter is somewhat mystifying to me. It goes to show, just as with a similar situation with J.K. Rowling and her treatment of trans people today, that the people who write some of the most moving and inspiring fiction that speaks to very specific anti-fascist values are perhaps not always the one best equipped to understand what they have worked on and created. While Star Trek and Deep Space Nine specifically have many problematic neoliberalist, colonialist, and American-centric assumptions and narratives baked into it, it is overall a series focused on themes of fighting back against the dictation and control over people's bodies, lives, and autonomy, very specifically as this type of control appears in fascist, imperialistic, and settler colonialist institutions.
They weren't a part of this rebellion. The Dominion knew that. The Founder knew that. Wei Yun knew that. To kill her and my son. The casual brutality of it. The waste of life. What kind of state tolerates the murder of innocent women and children? What kind of people give those orders?
Yeah, Damar, what kind of people give those orders? Oh, that was stupid.
Not at all. Damar has a certain romanticism about the past. He could use a dose of cold water.
I could have picked a better time.
If he's the man to lead a new Cardassia, if he's the man we all hope him to be. And the pain of this news made him more receptive to what you said, not less.
This leads me, though, to my second point, and something that I wish to speak to all of you directly about. The goal of this video is not to call out Ira Steven Behr specifically, though he deserves to be called out for signing that letter, but for me to talk about what it's like to wrestle with when someone that you've looked up to does something morally unconscionable like this. You see, I'm not doing this because I have a vendetta against Ira Steven Behr. In fact, Ira Steven Behr has been somewhat of a hero and model for me in my career. My hope one day is to become a writer and director in Hollywood, and perhaps, if my dreams ever come true, to write for Star Trek. And Deep Space Nine is the show that inspired me to do that as a kid. Not only that, Star Trek generally, and Deep Space Nine in particular, means so much to me over the course of my life. Star Trek gave me a lot of the values, my moral values that I hold dear to me. It also was a show, Deep Space Nine in particular, with the character of Jadzia Dax, was a franchise that helped me to understand who I was as a trans person, as a queer person, as a human being. To show you how meaningful Deep Space Nine is to me, I am currently 40,000 words into a script that I have been working on for almost 2 years for a video and potentially a book pitch on why I think Deep Space Nine is one of the most resonant, politically charged, meaningful, and beautiful science fiction shows in the history of television. And so to see Ira Steven Behr sign this letter is deeply, deeply painful. And I know there will be some people in the comments that say, well, Ira Steven Behr must be facing a ton of pressure to sign this letter, as many Jewish people within the Hollywood industry and within America generally are feeling the pressure to do so. Certainly, we have seen many people lose their jobs and places for speaking out against the Palestinian genocide. I myself have lost connections, both personal and professional, as well as had certain parts of my career hurt because I have been very vocal about what is happening to the Palestinian people. And while I wish that that hadn't been the case, I do not regret my choice one bit. Because while we can understand the pressure that many people feel, and I also certainly understand the fear that many Jewish people have in the face of all the anti-Semitism that is ongoing, both related to Israel's actions and also just because of the growing fascism in our world generally, it does not allow them to not be held responsible for their choices. And so I make this video not because I want to call out Ira Steven Behr. I wish I didn't have to. He's someone who means a lot to me and meant a lot to me and created work that meant a lot to me. But I also know signing that letter is morally unconscionable. And I make this video not just to wrestle publicly with my feelings on Ira Steven Behr in this letter, but to also speak to all of you who may be wrestling with very similar feelings, not just about Ira Steven Behr, but about other creators who you look up to, as well as maybe people in your personal life who you look up to or care about, who may also be supporting Israel's actions. And to say, while I certainly understand if you wish to try to reach out to them, to try to change their mind, to work with them. We all have different relationships with different people. It's also important to remember that the support needs to go to and the voices need to be heard of the Palestinian people right now. They are the ones in most dire and direct threat, and they need to be put first. And so, if it means me losing some part of my professional career, though I have been more lucky than some than others, as well as maybe losing personal and professional connections, then that's the price that I pay. And it is small, very, very small and insignificant compared to what the Palestinian folks are facing. And I'm by no means trying to end up on my high horse and think that me making this video or me speaking out is ultimately going to be the thing that changes everything. But every voice does matter. And not just your voice, but your actions. And our caring for the Palestinian people cannot just be when it hurts ourselves too. There's been recent talk about President Joe Biden denying further support to Israel after the recent horrific murder of aid workers within Gaza by the IDF. Which I am glad is now happening, but seemingly is only coming because white people died. And while the death of those aid workers is absolutely tragic, they shouldn't need to be there in the first place. And they wouldn't have to be if people spoke up and did something about it before this. Again, I don't think that I'm going to necessarily change the outcome of anything with this, but it is something that I can do, particularly within the Star Trek community. If by some wild happenstance Ira Steven Bear happens to hear this video, I do wish to say that I did have the deepest respect for you, and I do call on you to please speak out in support of the Palestinian people. It is never too late to change your actions. I don't necessarily expect him to do so if he is listening to this. I don't expect to be the reason for that to be the case. But within my community, as a Trekkie, it is something I can at least say, and maybe, in that small way, I can at least try to make a difference. My goal and intention here isn't to attack Ira Steven Bear. It isn't to condemn him, though I am doing that. My goal is to try to voice support for those who need it most right now. And I think, and all of us need to be doing that. And Ira is by no means alone in his actions, but he is someone who maybe can hear me or people within my community who are watching this video. Perhaps this video will cost me as well, but again, I do not regret it in the slightest, even as I wish that that didn't have to be the case. Star Trek has always been a franchise about infinite diversity and combinations, about depicting a world where we understand that humanity can only progress if we take delight in each other's differences, and not only just take delight, but fight for the personhood of everyone to live as themselves freely and without persecution. And that future can only come if we fight for it now. And if we aren't willing to do that, even against the people who we respect, then that Star Trek future will never come. And I, for one, want to fight for it.